Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Henrik Toft Sørensen, and I'm chair of the Department of Clinical Epidemiology at Aarhus University in Denmark. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this symposium. We are glad that so many of you have joined us today. And a warm welcome to our three speakers, Dr. Pollock, Dr. Simonsen, and Dr. Petersen. We are delighted that you have accepted our invitation to speak today. In a few minutes, I will give the microphone to Dr. Jan van den Broeke, who will chair this symposium and who will introduce the program and will introduce the speakers. The overall topic of today's symposium is how are we going to live with COVID in 2022 and in the future. We seem at a very critical stage in this epidemic. Depending on the country we are living in, numbers are still increasing, peaking, or showing a first sign of decrease. We seem to be at a crossroad. People are wondering, how will we go on? How will we continue? This is the basis of the whole symposium today. I very much look forward to hearing the speakers and the discussion we will have today on this interesting topic. Thank you for joining the symposium. I look forward to an interesting afternoon with talks and lively discussion. So now I will pass the microphone to Professor Jan van den Broeke. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Hendrik. It's an honor for me to chair this symposium. On screen next to my image, you will see the program of this afternoon with our three eminent speakers and also with the time slots. As a chairman, I consider it my duty to stick to these time slots. The speakers will present different views. Their views are rooted in their scientific experience, but also because they're rooted in different countries with different ways of tackling the epidemic. The larger context in which people are living always determines the course of an epidemic and thereby also influences scientific views. That is why we have the first speaker from the UK, the second one from Denmark, and ultimately one who has experience in both countries. But there are not only speakers, there is also you, the audience. We want to make the discussion as interactive as possible. One advantage of this online format is that you can already start asking questions when people are speaking. You can do so by using the Q&A button, the question and answer button. When you pose a question, everybody in the audience, as well as the panelists, the speakers, will see your question. Someone else might comment. So if you in the audience are curious what questions have already been asked, whether you should add something or comment upon something, click on the Q&A. It is very important to use this Q&A actively. For the panel discussions at the end, and on the panel discussion, you will see all the speakers at the same time. We will choose which question will be discussed somewhat further by members of the panel. There is also, as you will see, a chat button. Please, as participants, use the chat box only for technical remarks to the panelists, like slide stop moving or image went down. Don't put questions about the content of the lectures in the chat, only in the Q&A. Finally, as mentioned, this symposium is being recorded. The link will be shared within about a day. Without further ado, I now give the screen to Dr. Pollock to first briefly introduce herself and then hold her talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm just going to go on to share screen on my talk. Okay, can you all see my screen all right? Can everybody see my screen? Maybe somebody can answer.
Yes, we can.
That's lovely. Thank you. So I'm a public and also in public health, and I'm a clinical professor of public health at Newcastle University. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's a good topic, and I've called mine Transitioning to Endemicity, What Public Health Measures Are Needed, because so many of the public health measures over the last 2 years have not really been public health measures. They've been really blanket measures applied without much evidence or them, and I'll come to this in a minute. My next slide. I have no conflicts of interest, no shares in companies or research grants from companies or funding. I'm a founding member of Keep Our NHS Public, an organisation dedicated to maintaining an NHS in the UK, and also president of the Socialist Health Association. So I'm going to start with, I don't know whether you can see my screen, if it's, sorry, I don't know how to get this. With endemicity and transitioning, and to give some sort of definition. So endemicity is a recognition that the virus never completely disappears, but we get a stabilization of infections resulting from a buildup of immunity in the population. And what we may see in the future is seasonal outbreaks, which will be fueled by pockets of new individuals who are susceptible, when immunity or viral mutation. Moving on now from endemicity to the fact that we've had, in Britain, like the rest of Europe, we've seen extraordinarily high case numbers. We had over a million in a week last week, although the numbers are now peaking and beginning to fall, as you can see. So we're moving from very, very high number of cases, but the reassuring have not been reflected in a dramatic rise in hospital admissions. Here are the admissions over time. And though they're high, the thresholds for people being admitted are lower than they were. People are staying far less long time compared with the earlier peaks. And we've probably had a lot more COVID than many of the other countries in Europe for various reasons. But also the other reassuring thing is that the people in our, it's pretty stable over time. Again, we've not seen this huge peak. So we've seen a major uncoupling of high cases from hospital admissions and an uncoupling from ICU admissions. And here you can see, if you look at the orange lines, COVID-19 2020 last year, the very high numbers of admissions in our critical care units, intensive care. But now you can see the orange line, and it's actually falling, and it's falling now to below what we have seen in previous years for all pneumonias, so it's no higher. And ICU admissions are really much lower than they are in previous years at the moment, compared with pneumonias. So this is a very reassuring picture given the very high case rates we've seen, and it's another indication of a move towards endemicity. The total deaths also, as high as they were, they're falling, and this is the black line compared with the 5-year average. So our deaths are a bit higher than normal. They fell below normal over the summer. They've all caused mortality, but the worrying aspect is not so much the COVID deaths, that's the dark blue, which are falling, and this is deaths involving COVID, but the excess deaths from other causes, which you can see, and these excess deaths are concentrated among the poor. This is from other causes, non-COVID. So we've got this very reassuring picture from COVID, the uncoupling of cases from hospitalizations, deaths and admissions, but excess deaths from other causes, no doubt due to the lockdowns and the consequences, the economic consequences. But the other picture that we're seeing is that Omicron appears to result in far less severe disease than with the previous variants. And most of the disease now is due to Omicron, but it's resulting in milder symptoms on the whole, less severe disease. And we're seeing a lot more reinfections, but they're milder. So of course, that's the picture for the UK. And of course, every country is at a different stage in this pandemic, depending on how much population immunity has been established, mainly from natural infection, though of course vaccines are important. Now know they're an important short-term measure and not in terms of establishing population immunity. So the different countries are at different stages, as we've seen. So your hospitalization and infection fatality rate will vary over time, depending on the age distribution of infection, new variants, amount of infection, etc. But what we're seeing in the UK is an IFR now falling dramatically to approximate and maybe less than flu. So let's come back to the goal of public health measures for the future. Very early on, it was optimistically thought, some people thought we could get zero COVID, the elimination of disease. But what is our goal? Is it control and suppression? Is it elimination of infection, of disease, or eradication? Well, in the UK, as in many other countries, the goal of elimination has now been grail. And really what we're into is the control and suppression of the disease. So recognizing endemicity and doing what we can to prevent severe seasonal outbreaks in the future. And of course, that means recognizing the role of the host, the agent, and environmental factors, all very complex, but these are the issues that we need to really think about. I won't come back to them very much, except I'll refer to them a bit in my talk, but the classic tools of public health are, of course, as you know, the outbreak control, breaking chains of transmission, good data monitoring, contact tracing, addressing the risk factors. And the main risk factor for bad outcomes from COVID is not so much vaccination status as poverty. Poverty associated with comorbidity and obesity. But of course, we also need good health systems and services, treatments, and vaccines, of course, have played a very important role in this pandemic in the short term. It is the unevidenced measures and emergency measures which were applied indiscriminately during the pandemic. And that includes what's quite shocking is 2 years on, we have really no good randomized controlled trials and very, very weak evidence for the benefits of many of these measures. So mass masking, mass testing, mass self-isolation, mass quarantine, mass school closures, blanket lockdowns, mandatory vaccines and COVID passes. And I'll come back to vaccinations. These were largely unevidenced, with very little evidence, and they were applied indiscriminately during the pandemic. In many cases, they were an inappropriate panic button, one could say. I'm going to move swiftly to two areas, mass testing and vaccination. Mass testing was widely adopted in the UK. And I have to say here that is screening. Mass testing of healthy people in the population is screening. But in the UK, we completely ignored the Wilson and Junger principles of screening. And not only that, we have a UK National Screening Committee, and the mass testing proposals never went near the UK National Screening Committee, and all the expertise was ignored. So mass testing was rolled out without thinking these very important principles that were applied from 1968, when Wilson and Junger realized that tests were going to be rolled out in the population willy-nilly and all the dangers. So I'd like to remind everybody of these, and I'm going to just take two examples from these 10 principles that was set out. The first is that there should be a suitable test, and the other one is the cost of case finding should be economically balanced in relation to medical. Now, what we do know is that mass screening is much easier said than done, because it doesn't start and end with a test. It starts perhaps with a test, But of course, it's a program with many, many steps in between. That test has to be reliable, acceptable to the population, but also we have to make sure that it's linked to the intervention. Any good if you don't have a good intervention. And of course, in the case of testing for COVID, the intervention is the isolation, the quarantine of cases, and contact tracing, the tracing of contacts and their self-isolation. So this is a very, very complicated intervention that hasn't been sufficiently thought about. And of course, in many ways, the WHO didn't do us any test rather than focusing on the clinical care and symptoms. So this is what Wilson and Jung said. The central idea of early disease detection is essentially simple, but the path to its successful achievement is far from simple, though sometimes it may appear deceptively easy. And I think there are a lot of lessons to learn from the UK experience, where actually it's been chaotic, confused, and one can say billions and billions of pounds, which could have been spent elsewhere, building up our health services, education, etc. And the first mistake was that we didn't separate out clinical testing symptoms from people who were asymptomatic. So when we report on our cases, for a long time, we were reporting asymptomatics together with symptomatics and polysymptomatics. So this is very confusing. What were we measuring? Were we measuring simply the volume of cases? Nor could we distinguish for a long time the difference between first infections, reinfections, or infections. And of course, infections were all defined as a case, a positive test. They weren't being defined through their clinical symptoms. Another problem is that when we were measuring hospitalizations, everybody who came into hospital had a COVID test, and we were reporting admissions with COVID rather than people who had COVID. And of course, around, we were greatly exaggerating the hospitalizations. The same happened for a while with death data as well, deaths with COVID rather than dying from COVID within a time period. So we've had real problems here over the definitions and the rollout. We also had problems because we didn't really stick to what the purpose of asymptomatic testing was. And it didn't follow the principle. We didn't evaluate whether testing of asymptomatic people was superior to the traditional contact tracing that we did. And if you do your contact tracing well, backwards and forwards, you should capture all cases rather than doing random testing, which is like looking for needles, transient needles in haystacks. And of course, the backward and forward contact tracing is the classical approach to outbreak control. It's impossible to do, of course, at one stage when you have so many numbers, so many cases. Stop. But the other question we didn't ask is how many people were being isolated unnecessarily? What was the yield and what were the costs and the opportunities? Of course, we should have an acceptable test, but the lateral flow tests, of course, were not developed by the manufacturers for testing on asymptomatic people, i.e. people with no symptoms. They were developed to be used as part of a clinical diagnosis. So what happened was our manufacturer and applied to itself, its own agency, the MHRA, for an exceptional use authorization. And it applied in the absence of good evidence. And so they were only given temporary exceptional use authorizations, but they have still failed to come up with good evidence that these tests are acceptable and suitable to the population. The other problem with the UK was constantly changing from the population were being asked to test twice a week. So that was 60 million tests twice a week. And it wasn't always clear, and people often used the lateral flow testing even when they had symptoms because it was much easier to access than going through the PCR route. Today, our guidance is that everybody should use it before visiting a vulnerable person or by a fully vaccinated and in addition, the government now has dropped all requirements for PCR tests to confirm the lateral flow test. So you can begin to see the chaos and the confusion. The self-testing kits themselves are very complicated, 20 pages of detailed instructions in English, with 5 small components which are very difficult to handle if you're elderly or you don't have good manual dexterity. They're also easy to fake. Self-report, so they could report any result they like. So children were dipping the results in orange juice and Coca-Cola and reporting their results as positive. They're not tests of infectiousness. The sensitivity is not particularly good, though Irene, of course, will be saying differently. But the real problem is, again, what is their significance in asymptomatic groups, which they'll be detecting as well as symptomatic, because we know that asymptomatics are less likely to transmit. And how useful are they now when we're seeing more and more reinfection? There are also questions raised as whether these tests are very good against all variants, e.g. Omicron. There's quite a lot of data on lateral flow tests and their shortcomings. And the question is a bad test better than no test? But even if you had a fantastic test, is it useful as part of the intervention? And here we come to how good are the interventions of self-isolation and quarantine. And we simply don't know, because we've never been able to follow up people to see whether they really do quarantine in practice and self-isolate. We've got a few results that we can report. So we've spent £6 billion on over 100 billion lateral flow devices, 37 billion on test and trace, which, although we've underspent on that. In December alone, we gave out 300 million tests, but we know that most of the tests that are given out are not registered. Our government report said only 14% of tests were registered, and we don't know what impact they had on transmission. The other worrying aspect is that of those people who get a PCR test, only 18% had symptoms asked for a PCR test, and only 16% of those testing positive and 20% of their contacts did not fully meet isolation requirements. The UK's parliamentary committees, National Audit Office and the Public Accounts Committee, has stated that the policy has not achieved its main objective of preventing transmission. It's muddled, overstated, and eye-wateringly expensive. So in billions of pounds on mass testing, not knowing the results, which has been increasingly confusing and increasingly distrusted by people. So I'm going to turn to now the role and goal of vaccination, which has been equally confused, partly because of all the discussion in the UK about herd immunity and a failure to understand what are we trying to achieve or articulate what we're trying to achieve. Elimination of disease, infection, suppression, or prevention of severe disease. And what we now know is prevention of severe disease, hospitalizations, and severe outcomes. But we were very muddled about the goal, partly because we didn't know what these vaccines would do and how good they'd be. But we've also been very muddled in terms of herd immunity, in thinking that the more people that you vaccinate, you're going to achieve some sort of threshold for herd. Clearly not the case. Population immunity is going to be largely dependent on the amount of natural infection that's happened in your population. So here you can see the vaccination across Europe, very, very high rates of vaccination all across Europe. And these figures are lower than they are because they include children and people who are only not eligible for vaccine. And the eligibility criteria in the population varies, but we've got very high rates in the UK, particularly high, 81% with first dose, 83%. This is age 12 and over. 63%. But actually, most people over the age of 65 have had their first and second dose, 99.6% of those over the age of 65, and 91% with a booster or third dose. So extraordinarily high rates in the UK of vaccine coverage. And yet we've had extraordinary high rates of COVID in the last week, 1 million cases alone. So that is because that vaccines, most infection and transmission is now occurring in those who are fully vaccinated. And we've known that since June. The majority of people admitted to hospitals and deaths are, of course, among those who are fully vaccinated. And this is really very important when we've got all the unvaccinated sentiment going on. The main risk factor for admission to hospital and bad outcomes and to ICU is poverty. And
Dr. Pollock, you have 5 minutes left.
And this is why vaccine passports are so problematic, because vaccination status doesn't translate into individual risk, because different levels of immunity to the same infection, vaccine efficacy changes over time, and it's not possible to adjust for the confounding. What we know is that vaccine effectiveness against symptomatic disease is significantly lower for Omicron and wanes to minimal or no for the 2 doses of vaccine. So here we have from the UK, but this is a summary that you can go back to later from Canada, UK, US, that's on the ECDC website, which shows you the dramatic waning of the vaccine effectiveness, which is largely probably due in part with the new variants, but here it's dropping dramatically over time for AstraZeneca to almost 0 at 25. Although the booster doses are, of course, are having an impact. But again, double dose of vaccines dramatically waning over time, with the booster doses improving. This is for Pfizer and Moderna. Secondary attack rates are similar in those exposed to vaccinated and unvaccinated index cases, although observational studies are conflicted and confusing because of confounding. And again, I can't stress enough that if your goal is to prevent hospitalization and death, we must address the antecedents, which are poverty. Quickly on natural immunity, it's been completely ignored in the UK. It's very important, we know. Immunity from previous infection is good and sustained. Past infection is conferring good protection against reinfection. Previous infection protects against reinfection, disease, and transmission. So this is very important. Although, of course, as time goes by, we'll see more reinfections occurring. The evidence shows that these are likely to be rare and milder, although we will see them more frequently as we are doing in the UK, but they will be milder. We're seeing protective immunity, which is consistent with long-term protection after recovery from SARS-CoV-2 infection. And yet immunity from infection is being not discussed and is being totally ignored. It's more effective. Natural immunity from infection is more protective than vaccination against SARS-CoV-2, beta, gamma, and we don't know about Omicron. Where
you have 2 minutes left now. Could you wrap up?
Well, I'm just wrapping up.
Yes, thank you.
The role of the media has been in instrumentalizing the science, causing division and confusion, engendering fear and stigmatizing unvaccinated groups. We're seeing huge polarization of debate along political lines. And as for COVID passes, I can leave mine. There's a complete lack of consensus on what a COVID pass. Many different variations being rolled out to extremes in Austria and France. But you can see that COVID passes really don't stand up because they don't reduce, vaccination doesn't reduce transmission and spread of disease in the long term. The aim may be to protect health services, but most people are vaccinated and most admissions are occurring now among the vaccinated. And what we're seeing is this is deeply political rather than grounded in any public health, causing huge division in the population. So it's time for a rethink on vaccine passes, COVID passes, vaccine mandates, asymptomatic testing, and even on repeat vaccinations. There are so many unaddressed questions, and I'm going to leave the list up and not run through them as I'm running out of time. But there are many questions that we need to understand, which is why aren't we talking about natural immunity following infection? Countries have had infection now by vaccination status and outcomes. When do we stop boosting? Who should be targeted for boosting? And why are we not addressing the social determinants of health? And lastly, should we be vaccinating children when benefits for them are unproven, risks unknown in the medium and long term, and the harms? Their infection levels have been very high already, and we know that in the long term, these vaccines are not transmission. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pollock. Thank you very much for setting the scene based on your experience and your views about what happened in the United Kingdom. Just for the participants, now I have remarked that one participant or one or two participants had asked questions about the talk of Dr. Pollock in the chat. Please do not use the chat. Contrary to many other things that you do in online life, do not use the chat except for technical remarks. If you have questions for one of the participants, for one of the panelists, or comments on questions, please use the question and answer button. Thank you again, Dr. Pollock. So it's now my turn to invite Dr. Simonsen from Denmark to again start with introducing herself and give the second talk of this symposium. Thank you.
So my name is Lone Simonsen. I'm a professor at Roskilde University, and there I head a Center for Pandemic Research. My own journey into this has actually been starting in Denmark many years ago, and I did my PhD in the US in population genetics, trained as a disease detective in Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. I worked in WHO in Switzerland. I worked on the National Institutes of Health on emerging infectious diseases. Then I came back eventually to Denmark and became a professor here. And I'm so excited to be able to start my research here in this country and to be able to help my country with this disaster we've been going through. I just want to say whatever I'm telling you, it's also on behalf of the other people in my research group here. It is people from Roskilde University, from mathematics and history, very interdisciplinary. But we also have epidemiology, bioinformatics, and microbiology presented in our group. So we're quite a very broad group that tries to shape a new field that you could call pandemiology. So the task at this meeting was set out that we were going to discuss at some point these questions. What have we learned during the COVID pandemic? How will we live with it in the future? And I just want to put these questions so you can sit and ponder them while I go through these slides to give some kind of background, and then I will attempt to answer these myself. But first, what is a pandemic, or where does it come from? Pandemics come as zoonotic diseases. They are transferred from animals, and there are really like three layers of this, three phases of it. The lower level you see is those that are lurking but not yet epidemic. You have, for example, bird flu that you are familiar with. It's just hanging out, but never being able to cause real sustained epidemics. In the middle layer, you have recent pandemic threats like that caused localized but real epidemics, such as SARS in 2003 in Asia and Canada and other places, and then Ebola in 2014 in Africa. But they didn't have it to become global pandemics, but they sure were scary enough because they had really high mortality risk. And then on top, you see three examples of the ones that became true pandemics. We had the 1918 Spanish flu that I'm going to show you some data from because they inform us now about pandemic duration. We have HIV/AIDS as another type of pandemic in 1970s, 80s. And now in 2020, we have declared the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's the top layer. That's the ones that go global and that eventually every human on this planet will have experienced. So what it takes to really make it as a pandemic virus for a new zoonotic virus is really that it's able to mutate, to accumulate, to allow effective human-to-human transmission. And you see here some examples of viruses trying to cross the animal-human interface and failing if there's a cross after maybe a few infected people. And then the lowest one is one that really managed to emerge. And that means it had a contact number, a transmission rate R0 that is greater than 1, meaning that every person infected will on the average pass it on to more than one other person. And that way you get an epidemic that typically is exponential in pattern. And the size of R0 determines also how many people will have to be immune before an epidemic stops. And we had measured this for the 1918 pandemic to be around 2 to 3, and we had measured the same for the original variants of COVID-19, and are not around 2 to 3. So this is a really fast-spreading pandemic virus we had at hand. In terms of the last 100 years, we've been through 5 pandemics actually. So you can see they happen regularly every 20th year or so. But out of these 5, 4 of them were influenza A viruses, and the last was COVID-19, a coronavirus. Only 2 of them were highly deadly. And the one is, of course, the Spanish flu, which will be the mother of all pandemics still for the time being. But the COVID-19, with over 5 million deaths reported, probably over 7 million deaths in our estimate in a recent commentary, but probably in truth, more likely over 20 million deaths already globally. And then, of course, we have the fact that there will be a disease X in the future. One day we'll have another pandemic. It could be of influenza again, or of another coronavirus, or it could be a disease we haven't thought about yet that could be that. So it's not over yet. This pandemic will be over, but we have to understand, we have to be prepared for future pandemics. So I want to tell you that we studied the 1918 pandemic and it does give us some clues to modern pandemic control. We see in 1918 that the pandemic killed young, healthy adults, the 15 to 44-year-olds, the middle band in my slide here. And you can see that there was kind of 4 waves that, and it's a very specific pattern. Normally young people don't die like that. And you can see that after 4 waves and during 2 years, by 1920, this was over, in the sense that you did not have this pandemic phase anymore, in which young people had huge excess mortality. It switched into something that was endemic, and you see returning epidemics every year, and that eventually it's old people who died. And that was not the case during the pandemic, where there was no really excess mortality in people over 45 in countries like Denmark, for reasons I don't have time to go into here. So then we had in WHO declaring the pandemic on 11th of March 2020, and much to something we really hadn't planned for, I guess, when we did pandemic planning before. Countries went into draconic lockdowns, both in Denmark, where we really did that on March 11th, but also internationally. Some countries have really, in long stretches of time over the last 2 years, been in a real lockdown. So one could ask, why did SARS coronavirus 2 cause a pandemic when that SARS threat in 2003, that was its cousin that really appeared in 2003 but didn't make it? What has it learned, this one that is so genetically similar to SARS virus? And there's really 2 tricks that it has managed. The one is that infectiousness can begin days before symptom onset, 2 days in fact. So you can be infectious without knowing it. And trick 2, many infections are asymptomatic, meaning that again, you can easily be walking around with an infection and be infecting others, but not knowing it. So for these reasons, it's a virus that learned how to go under the radar, and that's how it spread so effectively. Since then, the coronavirus 2 has undergone a rapid evolution. Much more so than actually I had thought it would be able to. But if you think about the R0 of the variants, the Wuhan was maybe 2.5, the first variant. Then we got the Alpha variant. It was 1.45 times faster maybe. And then we got the Delta variants, which spreads as fast as chickenpox, with an R0 of 6 to 8. This really takes 95% of the population immunized before you can stop something like that. And then we have the first escape variant, Omicron, here right now, with probably a lower R0 in the order of 3 to 4, but also, fortunately, a lower relative mortality. So that's sort of what happens. And of course, there can be future variants going forward. A question that comes early in a pandemic is really, how deadly is it? We talked about how infectious is it, but really how deadly is it comes right after. You can measure this in different ways. You can ask, what is the risk of dying if I'm infected? What's the risk of dying if I am symptomatic and have illness? How much is the excess mortality in our country? And we can also ask, what is the avoided worst case scenario? And you can ask then, of course, how deadly is the current Omicron pandemic relative to what we had before? And I want to stress, I think a little different from Professor Pollock, that the major factor and the way dominant factor explaining mortality with this new coronavirus is age. You see in this graph data from China that came already in Lancet in 2020, and you will see data like this from anywhere you look, that if you're over 80, the case fatality is huge. In the nursing homes, about 30% of people who are infected will die before the vaccines. And that's really, that's just stunning. That's like the elderly going through something similar to the plague, while young people in the other end of the spectrum and children are not really at very high risk. So that's the real biggie here, is the age patterns. And it's very different from seasonal. It's not very different from seasonal flu, where you also have mostly elderly dying, except this is more extreme ascent. But it's very different from 1918 Spanish flu, as I was showing you. There was young adults dying, and therefore with many more years of life lost. Now, these lockdowns that we did were much more effective than we thought. Here in Denmark, we talked a lot about how we would have a green wave that would respect the hospital capacity at any time, sort of flattening the curve, is instead of this red aggressive wave that would happen if we didn't do so. But what actually happened, to our surprise, was it worked a lot better than that. And instead we got a little a yellow curve that quickly sort of was under control, and a summer basically without the virus following in 2020. So we asked the question, how on earth could that be? Why did we do so much better than we thought we were going to do? Because this whole idea of the green wave was based on experience with 1918 pandemic flu experienced in 17 US cities. So we thought we knew that it was going to be green, and then it was just much smaller. And that's research that I've done in collaboration with the physicists at the Niels Bohr Institute. And what we think really is going on is that the COVID-19 has this super spreading phenomenon that 10% of the cases infect most of the forward cases. So we used an agent-based model to look at what did this phenomenon mean when you start pressing on a virus, as we do when you are doing lockdowns and people don't meet in the public space so much anymore. And what we found is we can really reproduce this little yellow curve quite easily. And we conclude in this work, which was published in the PNAS, that super spreading is like the Achilles heel of the SARS coronavirus. It sounds like a super bad thing for people, but really it's a super bad thing for the virus. It's a really good way that we can control it when we control how many people you meet in the public space. Then followed the vaccine miracle, which was really, we had rapid development and new vaccine platforms. We had them rapidly tested for safety and efficacy within 8 months of the pandemic being declared. They were highly effective, much more so than, for example, flu vaccines. And they were a unique resource to avoid serious COVID. But they were unfairly distributed between rich and poor nations. And this is just a fact, something that is something we'll remember about this pandemic. So what did we really avoid with the vaccination? We tried to sort of guess at what would have happened in Denmark if you, or just model it really, how much would have happened in Denmark if you didn't vaccinate. And we computed that you wouldn't have had 2,000 deaths, you would have 20,000 instead. But people thought that was awfully theoretical. But now you actually see this kind of thing playing out in countries that didn't vaccinate. Here we're looking at Bulgaria, where because of misinformation about the vaccine, 20 to 30% of the population was vaccinated in this fall here. And there, 0.8%, almost 1% of the population has died of COVID. Now, this is not different from what we experienced in Denmark in the 1918 Spanish flu. It is a catastrophe. It's a lot of deaths. Whereas in Denmark, where we had the economic ability to hold back the infections with our various strategies for a long time, and then we had the population getting vaccinated in a huge way, we have hardly any excess mortality. So that's, I think, really demonstrates this comparison that it really matters if you can afford pandemic control, and then if you have a population that trusts and will be vaccinated like we did. You can see around the world here all kinds of countries. The blue ones to the left are the ones that vaccinated most, Spain, Portugal, Denmark. And you can see very little reported deaths. And at the bottom of the graph, you see the countries that had very low vaccination rates, like Bulgaria, and you can see the high excess mortality that is reported. And then on top of this, all the deaths that are not reported, which you will see in excess mortality. Now, we of course wanted to know if the vaccine worked, so we followed this at the pandemics group in the Delta period as the vaccine was rolled out in the fall of 2021, at which point most adult Danes were vaccinated. In fact, 95% of Danes over 50, the ones who typically go to the hospital. And also, so we had a possibility to split the hospitalizations between the vaccinated and unvaccinated. And you can see in the blue curve that even though there were more, and you're right, Dr. Pollock, there's more people in the hospital who are vaccinated. But if you control for the fact that there are many more people who are vaccinated, you will see a huge difference in the risk of getting hospitalized. So that the blue curve is the unvaccinated. They are at a much higher risk of being hospitalized than the vaccinated in the red curve. And underneath in the green numbers, you can see we computed the vaccine effectiveness to be somewhere between 90 and 95% for most adult age groups, and a little lower for the very old people, 80%. But still a very good, amazingly good vaccine, really. So what was really achieved with the vaccine? I think what the metaphor that I like to use is we used to have a nasty tiger on our hand, which was had a potential for enormous amounts of excess mortality around the world. And then we had a high vaccination coverage in some countries, and that really led to we were left with an angry cat, which is it's not like it's not dangerous like flu or something, but it's not like this highly deadly pandemic that we had before. So really what we're talking about is that there's a decoupling in like now infections may rise with this new virus, but there's not a similar rise in the severe outcomes like hospitalizations, ICU utilization, and deaths. So that's the scenario going into now that we have COVID-19 Omicron variant entering stage and being the first drift variant. And in the early, South Africa went through this first, and you can see in these two waves how the decoupling looks. You had a Delta wave in the summer 2021 in the Gauteng region here in South Africa, and you see very high levels of cases at hospital admissions, deaths, and excess deaths. And then you see during the Omicron wave a really high number of cases too, but not very many excess deaths and deaths. And that is exactly what we were hoping to see also in other countries, but we couldn't really know it yet because our populations are different. We have aging populations, not so in South Africa. We have vaccination coverage. They have natural protection because they have been through major waves of epidemics before this, and only a low rate of vaccine protection. And really what we think is going on now with Omicron is that we're beginning to see a situation where hybrid vigor immunity will be what helps us out of the pandemic phase and into the afterlife of this pandemic, which is the endemic phase. And there are two very nice commentaries in Science and Nature. You can go and read these two, where they are just discussing this, that if you have some kind of combination of vaccine with natural boosting, a natural infection, you will actually get to a place where your whole immune system is much better often much more capable of dealing with future variants. You have much better, higher level of antibodies, but you also have a better effect in the memory cells and the CD4 T cells, and therefore you get a broader cross protection against other variants in the future. So we have also observed this decoupling phenomenon in Denmark. These are data from our Staten Serum Institute that my postdoc Rasmus had been just quickly looking at for up to last week. And you can see in Denmark the cases are exploding with Omicron because we are really having quite an open society with this. But the hospitalizations and ICU admissions and deaths are very low. And when you speak to the ICU physicians, they will tell you, well, several of the people there, of the people who are scored as a COVID patient, are in fact there because they accidentally had a COVID positive test, but that's not really what they are under treatment for. And the same thing about the deaths. You have a definition of if you tested positive months before you died in a traffic accident, you would actually be counted as a death of COVID. So therefore, these numbers are even high, even though they look so flat relative to the and decoupled from the phenomenon. So really, we're in a mild pandemic phase now. So now, after all this, I will attempt to answer the questions that we were sort of asked to look at here by the organizers. So my take on this is, will we continue to vaccinate? Yes, we will go into an endemic phase, but probably we will only vaccinate elderly and at-risk populations, like people who really have trouble with their immunity, and only in autumn. So my best guess is that next time we get vaccinated is some subpopulation, the elderly, with the updated variant that really captures Omicron better than the current vaccine. Will we continue to use masks? No, I don't think so, but maybe we will think maybe it's a good idea in places like transportation when any epidemic is in town in the future. Maybe we learn something from this pandemic about how to do a little better in terms of hygiene, also when influenza and other diseases are peaking. The third one, will we continue to use a COVID passport? No, I don't think so. But I think maybe in some countries they will ask it. So international rules may force us to do so when traveling. Will we stockpile rapid tests? Well, I certainly hope so. This was a really bad situation in the beginning of this pandemic, that we had such low test capability and so few masks and protective gear. This is definitely what we need to do. We need a good stockpile for the next time. And actually it's amazing. It's in the equipment, like in this country, it's like in white plastic trays that are produced in China, which just didn't have enough. This can be easily done by putting in the stockpile in peacetime. The last thing is, will things be altogether different in the future? Yes, absolutely. I think the pandemic phase will end this spring, and I think we'll be going into a controlled winter seasonal outbreaks, like we do seasonal flu, all thanks to this hybrid immunity that comes from our vaccine, and also with the natural infection on top of that, boosting. So I just thought I would tell you how I will remember this pandemic, how I see we'll remember this pandemic. I think, first of all, we were so ill prepared. It was really amazing. We had probably not seen anything that was severe for a long time. So we had the 2009 pandemic, which was very mild, and we're thinking maybe pandemics are not much. We had the 2003 SARS, which really didn't affect us, but it really scared the people in Asia. So we were here just really not really ready. We didn't have test capability, not protective gears. Then we'll remember the draconic lockdowns that were really unexpected, something that reminds us of the Middle Ages and how we dealt with plague and smallpox a long time ago. But that really, I don't know if it's really needed, all the aspects that are in the lockdown, but somehow it worked well. But in the future, I'm hoping we can learn which particular aspects of it we can use and not do the whole thing. Maybe it's in limiting the large groups that's important. Maybe it's not the school closings. All these things have to be figured out here in the aftermath of the pandemic, or as soon as we can, really. We remember the catastrophe in Italy in March 2020, where the health system was on their knees with this pandemic, and it was probably the real reason why Denmark and other countries locked down at the time. We remember that we're really not good at sharing critical resources internationally. And as a global health professor, I'm very alarmed about this, that we can have a situation with only one really good tool, which is the vaccines, and we just can't find a way to share it in an equitable way around across the world, so that really the rich countries are doing third doses while first doses haven't even reached the high-risk populations in many low-income countries. It's also true for respirators. Then we remember the long COVID, the chronic sequela of the infection, something I didn't speak about here, but it's really something that's important going forward. How will that go? Will it be so that people actually have lost their sense of taste and smell for long periods of time, or maybe forever? Will a subset of population have problems with their lung capacity and blood clotting going forward? Can it actually affect life expectancy in the long run? We will see that about later. Then we have the high global excess mortality. There was really 20 million deaths is probably not the end of it, but that's probably how we remember it. And remember, it could have been so much worse without the vaccines. In Denmark, we had, in my best guess, we have avoided at least 20,000 deaths, seen 2,000, so maybe we have only 1/10 of the possible deaths we could have had. And so that's probably true for most wealthy countries. So maybe 20 million could have been 50 million if we hadn't had the vaccines or something. And then we will remember that the pandemic phase ended in 2022. And for you young people out there, I really feel this is especially pertinent for you, because it's been a remarkably large percentage of your entire lifetime that has been taken up with this. Maybe it's a little reminiscent of the World War II for my parents' generation. That was so defining for their lifetime. So I hope you have been okay and everything. How can we be better prepared for future deadly disease ex-pandemic? That must be the question we're asking ourselves now. How can we do better? And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Simonsen, for gaining time without detracting from the excellence of your talk. Okay. Thereby, I give the screen to Irene Petersen.
Thank you. I'll just upload my slides. And I would be grateful if somebody could confirm that they can see them.
We see your screen?
Yeah, and I'm gonna start now.
Yes.
So I'll just minimize this one. Yeah. Okay. So my title is Living with COVID Doesn't Mean We Should Stick Our Heads in the Sand. And I feel sometimes that is what had happened in UK. We have had a prime minister who have told us several times, first it would be over within 3 weeks, then it would be over by Christmas. And now we are 2 years on. And I think many of us have realized that we can't just stick our head in the sand and pretend it's all over. So I'm employed by UCL in London. I'm also employed at Aarhus University, and I have no conflicts of interest. So as Lone mentioned, COVID was declared a pandemic on the 11th of March 2020. And I just thought I would include this quote because it puts things in perspective. At that time, there was 118,000 cases reported and 4,291 deaths. Things have moved on quite a bit since. So where are we? In UK, I took these statistics from yesterday, and for the Danish audience or people outside UK, you can see that we are approximately 66 million people. So there have been 15 million cases reported. there are, of course, far more people who have been infectious, because at the beginning of the pandemic, we had no test capacity in UK, like many other countries. 670,000 have been admitted, and 150,000 have died. And this is from the coronavirus dashboard, which I can highly recommend. It's a fantastic source if you want to keep an overview of what's going on in UK. And the graphs here below demonstrate the time trends. And as you can see, that the number of tested people have dropped dramatically in January. And we are now seeing also a slight decrease in people admitted to hospital, and also, well, it's not quite turning yet for people dying. All these measures are having the same issues as Lone raised, that there are people who are admitted with COVID, and also now that such a high proportion of the population have COVID, the death also will include people who were who died for other causes than COVID, but they would still be counted because of the high prevalence. In Denmark, there is about 6 million people, and there have been around 1.2 million cases, and 26,000 admissions, and about 3,000 deaths. Again, there's a fantastic resource if you want to follow the cases, and I've given the link below here. So I have made a very, very rough comparison, and I think there are many things that should be taken into account. But if we look at the ratio, we say UK divided by Denmark times 10, then we will see about 1.3 times more cases in UK, 2.4 more admissions, and 4.3 times more deaths. I admit this is a very rough comparison, but it's just to give you a feel of a comparison. In terms of vaccinations, in UK, everybody above the age of 12 have been offered a vaccine, and this is also again from the dashboard, and as you can see, there has been a high uptake. However, there is still about 5 million people above the age of 12 who are unvaccinated, and about 500,000 over 50 who are still unvaccinated. And these are the figures from Denmark. You can't compare them directly because they are also vaccinating children down, I think it's down to age of 5 in Denmark. But as you can see, again, there's a very high uptake of vaccine also in Denmark. So we have seen different responses to COVID, and as Lone outlined, lockdown was our first response, and that was probably the only option we had at the time. And also, I think many were scared of the exponential growth we saw. Other responses have included work from home, face mask, vaccine, testing, and COVID pass, to name a few, but these have been some of the key tools we have had or have in our toolbox. So now we are at a crossroad. So what about the future? Where are we going? I think we are reaching a point where we may have sufficient immunity to return to some kind of normal life. It's important that we are aware that we are still in a pandemic, but we are moving in the right direction. And with vaccine plus Omicron, we are now reaching a very high level of temporal immunity. Earlier on, we were or some of us were probably hoping that it would be a more fixed immunity, and we would reach a fixed herd immunity level. I think there are few people who still believe that it is possible, and we are aware that it's likely that we will see future smaller waves, particularly in the winter, because of vaccines and immunity from infections to wane over time. We still have many cases, but we see relatively few severe cases and death. So the question is then, how are we going to live with COVID? I think there are some very important tools. One is the vaccination, there's antivirals, and there's a component where we need to monitor future outbreaks and react if we see them early. Then I think we have a fantastic opportunity now to reduce transmission by testing and isolating of infectious individuals early on. And finally, we may look into how we can use other mitigations in the future, such as ventilation and face mask. So one thing that also have been outlined previously is that with the vaccine, we are breaking, or not completely, but we are to some extent breaking the link between cases and hospitalizations and death. So this graph is from the Global Institute, and it is data from the UK Health Security Agency. And on the left side, you see the hospitalization rate in people over 50 over time. And this is unvaccinated per 100,000, and this is the vaccinated. And as you can see, there is a clear difference, and the vaccine really makes a difference. And the same is the case in terms of death. There is a substantial difference, and I think this is really one of the most important things with the vaccine. We probably hope that the vaccine would reduce transmission more than it does. It does reduce transmission indirectly because there are fewer people who get ill when they are vaccinated, and in that way it has a positive impact on lowering transmission. So this is also from the UK Health Security Agency, and they have been looking at the vaccine effectiveness. And what they find is that if you have, and this is effectiveness against Omicron, and what it suggests is that if you have one dose, you have a reduced likelihood of ending up in hospital. But if you have had 3 doses, you are pretty well protected, at least for a period of time. But one of the issues is really, how do we reach out to the unvaccinated? In UK, there are about 5.5 million people unvaccinated. And there is still 500,000 above the age of 50. For many of the young people, they may decide not to get vaccinated because the risk of ending up in hospital is low, and many will also by now have been infected at least once. But for the group above 50, it is another matter. I did a back of the envelope calculation, which suggests that a person over 50 who is unvaccinated has about 17 times risk of ending up in hospital compared to a person who is vaccinated. So there is a good reason to try to reach out to people who haven't received a vaccine yet. And there are many reasons to why people haven't been vaccinated. Some people are very clear they don't want the vaccine for various reasons. Other people, it's simply because they haven't got access to the vaccine centers, or that they, for one reason or another, haven't really got it yet. So I think it's important that we address mobility and access, but also that we involve the local health providers, so primary care, and that they reach out to individuals in their surgeries. And it's about better communication rather than just mandating. So how do I see the future vaccine program? I wouldn't be surprised if we soon will get fourth dose to those above 70 and to those with little immunity. And also, I think it's likely that we may see annual boosters equivalent to a booster program we have seen for influenza. I don't know whether we will see vaccination of children. In some countries, they have reached out to vaccination of children down to the age of 5. In UK, it's still only for children above 12 years who are included in the vaccine program, and it has been a hot topic for debate for a long time. Also, I think it is right to be clear that there are 2 ways of getting immunity. I don't like the phrase natural immunity. I think we should say immunity by infection and immunity by vaccination. But this is from a study also conducted in UK, the Simonsen study, where they have compared the effectiveness of vaccines against vaccines plus infection. And as you can see, 3 doses of the vaccine and 1 dose of infection and vaccination provide equivalent immunity. Of course, the confidence intervals are very wide here, so we should take that into account. The other thing I'm hoping that we will be able to make more use of in the future is the antiviral to those who need it most. I don't think it should be something that we should use in the full population, but it should be something that should be rolled out to those who are immunocompressed. And we have the opportunity for that because we now have access to rapid tests and they can start treatment soon after they have tested positive. So in the future, we will also need to monitor outbreaks. And again, I want to highlight this website or this survey from the Office for National Statistics, which have followed the COVID pandemic in UK and randomly tested a sample of the UK household over the pandemic. It's a fantastic resource, and I hope it's going to continue for some time yet. The other thing we should consider more, and I am aware this is also happening in Denmark, is sewage monitoring, which is a very unintrusive way to keep an eye on outbreaks and can be the first point to indicate that there is a problem in a local area. And then I will talk a little bit about how we can contain future outbreaks with rapid testing. And you may note that Allyson and I have very different views on this because I think that rapid testing is probably the most effective tool we have available. And I think what we have seen here is a paradigm shift in the way we think about testing. So I see rapid test as a public health tool, not a diagnostic tool. And I think some of the key points here is that it is a fast test, it is a relatively cheap test, and it enables people to test when they need it, when they need to. And I have a small figure here, and I apologize if it is small, but I think that the key point here is to illustrate that we have on the x-axis, we have time since you were exposed to the virus, and on the y-axis, we have the viral load. And the pink period illustrate when you are infectious. And with the lateral flow test or the rapid test, you are able to detect people in that period. In contrast, we also have the PCR test, which are based on identifying genetic material that you may have in your body. And many people continue to have genetic material in their body for a long time. And therefore, often PCR tests might identify people who are no longer infectious, but still have genetic material in their body. So in many ways, I think the lateral flow tests are much more suitable for identifying infectious individuals of people who are infectious with COVID. So what we saw in the beginning was that a lot of comparative studies were made between the rapid antigen test and the PCR test. And these validation studies that used PCR as a gold standard, and often they showed that the sensitivity of the rapid antigen test, sometimes it was 40%, sometimes it was 69%, and sometimes it was 82%. And that was even for the same test. And I and other colleagues thought about this and thought, what is going on here? Is it that the PCR test is testing too much, or is it that the lateral flow test is testing too little? So we did a small paper which was published in Clinical Epidemiology, where we recalibrated the sensitivity of the rapid antigen test. So we defined pi, which is where you take the proportion of individuals who are shedding the COVID virus and divide it with the proportion of individuals who have the viral RNA. And if you test in an asymptomatic population, it will be about half of the people are actually shedding the virus, and therefore pi would be between 0.4 to 0.5. On the other hand, if you test in an asymptomatic population, you would have more people who are actually shedding the virus. So when you see a relative sensitivity of 40%, actually the absolute sensitivity is more likely 80 or close to 100%. But you can read more about this in this little paper. So I think there is a great use future for use of rapid testing, and there are different ways we should use rapid test, and we are still learning about it. So there's the one way is the regular monitoring, so we can use them as fire alarms. And that would be, for example, where you test in an asymptomatic population. And if you identify people who are infectious, then you would start to test in more detail.
Dr. Petersen, you have 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I'm nearly finished. The other way is to test if you're suspicious that you might have an infection. So if you have a sore throat or a runny nose, a lot of people are using the rapid test, and they suddenly realize, oops, yes, I am actually positive. Then we are seeing more use of close contacts. And finally, in the last couple of weeks, we have also seen test to release. So people who are infectious are now or have been isolating. Instead of isolating for 10 days, with the aid of rapid testing, you may be able to reduce that to 6 or 7 days. So there's a lot of future use in terms of rapid testing, not necessarily only for COVID, but you could also think about it for other infectious diseases. So I think we will use rapid tests to contain future outbreak. On the other hand, I think we should only use PCR testing for sequencing. They are not really suitable for widespread testing. They are simply too slow and they're too expensive. The great advantage of rapid testing is that you can test at home. You don't need to go to a test center. You can simply do it at home. We should also look into development of new testing technology and see how we can use them in the future. Finally, I think one thing that often has been underestimated is the public behavior. And this is from the BBC website, but you can see that, and it's from a Comics study that illustrate that during lockdown, people see fewer people, but actually in UK, it appears that a lot of behavioral change happened after we ended all restrictions in the middle of July. People were still seeing fewer people, and I think one of the reasons why we are where we are today is simply because people have changed behavior and seeing fewer people, and therefore there are fewer super spreading events. So my final remarks are that we are on the right way. It's very likely we will see future outbreaks. But also I think one of the positive is that we now have the right tools in place, and hopefully we will never ever go back to where we were in 2020. Thank you.
Okay, Irene, thank you so very much for your overview, contrasting British, Danish, and approaches and looking at the future. We are now entering the general discussion, and I would like to ask all panel members, the speakers and all panel members, to turn on their videos and to turn on their microphones. And I've already seen that the Q&A facility has been really greatly used, and several of you have already, also the speakers have already used it and answered. So this allows me to start with another question. That is a question about the future, which is a question about the future of manpower. And I would like to ask it to Dr. Lone Simonsen. That is, I've seen in her self-presentation that she was trained as a disease detective in the early 90s in CDC in Atlanta. And we all know the disease detectives, several crime novels have been written about the disease detectives, movies have been made. The program does not exist anymore. It's now something like Outbreak Investigation or something like that. But you are now the head and the person who is in charge of many other similar programs. So my question to you, for the younger members in this audience, if a young person in this audience, an epidemiologist, a medical doctor, says, well, this is very interesting, infectious disease. I never knew it was so very interesting. I would like to make a career of that. How would she or he go on doing that?
Oh, there's many ways to go about it. If you're actually medically trained, you are automatically, you can be an epidemiologist in a Scandinavian country. That's how traditionally epidemiologists happen here. You train in medicine, then you specialize in epidemiology. What happens is that there's a whole world out there where epidemiologists are something else. It's people from very quantitative fields, maybe population genetics, physics, mathematics, quantitative biology of some sort, even demographics and economics. And they go into training to understand the population dynamics of epidemic diseases. And that's and so the thing I trained in is called the Epidemic Intelligence Service at the Centers for Disease Control. And they used to only take in medical young doctors, and then they would train them. But now it's there's many different people there, also population geneticists like I was then, and all kinds of people train to understand how to, and because we were then different, it's fun to go and try to see if we can stop epidemics with that sort of synergy of that comes out of people coming from different fields. Otherwise, I think the one can go into bioinformatics and train masters on top or something to learn how to deal with data in a clever way, because in the future there'll be so many data and there'll be relatively few people who have the time and whereabouts to actually deal with them and understand what it means.
Okay, I've been corrected also in the chat by someone saying the disease detectives were changed into the Epidemiologic Intelligence Service, and the Epidemiologic Intelligence Service still exists. But is there...
Maybe I should just tell you, it actually, there's 3 Danes who ever practiced in that, trained in that.
Okay.
Me, Thea Fischer, who you all know from the news, and a third person whose name I can't remember. All 3 women trained over the last 20 years, 30 years in this program. So it's a...
But isn't there any European program that does something similar?
There is one, but I think it's much smaller in scope, really. There's I forget its name. Do some of you remember? It's at the Statens Serum Institute. You can go and train in epidemiology. If you're European, you can switch to another country, but then you also have to take on the language, what they're spoken there. Like try Hungary.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so much. So we will now go on with the questions and answers, but of course, maybe some of the speakers want to react to each other. Is there anybody from the speakers who wants to react to each other? Not really. Okay. Then in the questions and answers, I see that there has been already quite a lot of answers to questions by Lars Jørgensen, Gitte Frausing, and by Elena Dudukina have been answered, and have been answered by several people. One topic that I'd like to go back into is the idea about, it's a question asked by Lars Jørgensen. What do you think is the main drivers, has been the main drivers to reduce deaths in Denmark? And this goes a little bit with the other question that was already answered about like Hungary, where you have a high mortality in people of low economic class, also amongst the younger people. So could the panelists comment about what the main drivers might have been for, say, the success in Denmark? And the other aspect is, in other countries, what circumstances, what socioeconomic circumstances might be more unfavorable? I'm not just talking about vaccines and other things, but where are the socioeconomic circumstances more unfavorable to combating an epidemic? It's one of the...
Well, I could take it on. In Denmark, I think there's 2 big factors that determined the fact that we had no excess mortality and really won the gold. If this was soccer, we would have won the gold in epidemic control. I think some countries like ours with no excess mortality. And that's due to a combination of the economic might and the ability to keep epidemic control until the vaccine came, and then the the ability to get the population to agree to be vaccinated, and that way the vaccine just kept the deaths out. So that was very good. But look at a country like Peru, they did exactly that. They sent people home. They locked down in the spring 2020, but they couldn't afford keeping people fed and sort of alive, and now that no jobs had been there. And there's actually articles written about this, how people end up going back to their villages from Lima, and they just end up having a huge epidemic, wave after wave. So even by the time the vaccines came, they already had tons of excess mortality, and they are one of the top scores on excess mortality this day.
Yeah, okay. There was a hand raised by Irene.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why Denmark have had a low mortality is one that we locked down early, so that we never got these high numbers as we have seen elsewhere. That also explained some of the high mortality in UK, because we were slow on the mark. It took a couple of weeks after they had locked down in Denmark before UK finally locked down. I think the other reason why Denmark have done well is because you have sick pay in Denmark. So people who are sick with COVID, they have actually an opportunity to stay at home and are not at risk of losing their home and their job, etc., in the same way as people in UK. And I think that is one of the reasons why we also see a much higher infection rate among the most deprived in the UK, and also by ethnic minorities, is because there is no security net for many people.
Okay, maybe Dr. Pollock, yes, I thought that this would be a point that you would like to comment upon. Yes.
Thanks. Well, I can't comment on Denmark, but the big mistake in the UK was perhaps we have already run down our health and social services so much. And we knew in February 2020 that older people were most at risk. As Leonie said, we knew we did nothing in the nursing and residential care homes. And in the first 4 months, that's where most people were dying. 50% of deaths were happening there. That was a sector that had almost no staff, huge staff vacancies, untrained staff, where people died terrible deaths alone. Their relatives were not allowed to visit and come and be with them. It is quite horrendous. So we had excess deaths because of the total neglect of what was happening in social care. And I think that will, we have done nothing. What we should have done is we should have nationalised the workforce right away and redeployed staff into the nursing, residential and community care homes. And that is the great untold story of why we did so badly in the first 3 or 4 months, in addition to all the other things that we've mentioned. Yeah. Of course, poverty is really important. It's a big risk factor, as Irene has said. People didn't have the social security net. And the people that were delivering our groceries to us were, of course, poor. Yeah. And though the government did do something around that, we had nothing like the social security safety net in Denmark or in some of the other countries. We're much more like the US now in that respect, and we're rapidly continuing on that route.
Thank you.
Okay. I would like to say, especially also in terms of the care homes, at the beginning, patients were discharged to care home. So they were not only not protecting, but they were also seeding many, many infections into care homes. It is a tragedy.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, the interaction between say occupation and socioeconomic class also struck me in a publication from the London School of Hygiene by Neil Pearce, where it first appeared that people who had a job with a very public face, like policemen, bus drivers, and things like that, they had a lot of COVID and excess mortality. a lot of COVID and excess mortality. But then it happens that after adjustment for the areas where they lived, meaning their crowded living conditions of bus drivers, policemen, the whole thing disappeared relative to other occupations. So that it was not really their occupation being in contact with the public, but that it was their home circumstances. That was the really great driver.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I see that in the chat, one person has presented, going back to that idea of training, the EPIET fellowship with a link. But since it's in the chat, it can only be seen, this Louise Muller, it can only be seen by the panelists. So I ask Louise Muller, could you please send that link, link with training facilities by EDC in Europe, in infectious disease epidemiology. Could you send that also to the question and answer so that everybody can see it? I hope she's still here. Okay.
And there's also a link to the EIS program in the Atlanta, Georgia.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. So that's yeah. Okay. Wait a moment. Let's see whether there are other questions that might be of interest. Yes, there was the other idea by Lars Jørgensen, the potential problem with the echo chambers, social media, traditional media, image, etc., etc. I recall seeing a WHO report from before this epidemic about future epidemics. It was 1 or 2 years from before this epidemic, but it mentioned already that convincing the population would be much, much, much more difficult than ever before, given, amongst others, the social media. What do you panelists think?
Sorry.
You have no real thoughts about this.
Could you repeat that question? Sorry, the sound keeps coming and going here.
Okay, yes. That WHO already mentioned before this epidemic that the social media might be not a good force if you want to introduce general measures in society. What do you think?
Well, I think social media is just a reflection of what's going on in society.
Yes.
And the political discord. One of the big problems with the whole response to the pandemic was it was split along right and left lines.
Okay.
Mask,
yeah.
The left, progressives on the left went pro-mask.
Yes.
So this was the whole position, was that we didn't have a coherent, informed, evidence-based debate when we thought about hierarchies of evidence, when we thought about what we were trying to achieve. And that is still ongoing today, this whole political polarization and a split along left and right lines. And so you find yourself as a public health in camp because you're thinking, well, where's the evidence for this? You know, where's the public health evidence? And vice versa. So the other thing is that the media has very much instrumentalized debate. It's chosen specific scientists in order to instrumentalize the debate. And that's particularly the case in the UK, but also in France. And I think that's really it's been very unhelpful. But social media is just simply a reflection of all the different discourse in society. And it can also be very useful as well as sources of information.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's see, there was a question also.
Could I say something? Yes. I think it's more than just a reflection of the society. I think actually it makes the polarization even sharper Often I get called all sorts of things on Twitter that I'm pretty sure few people would say that to me if they met me face to face. It's very easy to do that in social media. But also, I think we should be aware that there are people who are making money on the social media. And it took me quite some time, for example, to realize that a lot of the anti-vax on social media, that are a small group of people who are actually making a lot of money by posting on Facebook and Twitter and selling books and selling vitamins, supplements, and using social media as a platform. So it's not just innocent. I think it is actually, we should be aware of this as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think in Denmark it's just been there's been a megaphone of social media just magnifying this voice of who are these experts? There's no virus. What are you doing? The vaccines are dangerous. All these things. But really, when you think about that, over 95% of people over 50 got the vaccine, so there can't be that many of them, I figure, from just the way we're behaving in terms of what we do. So we have the HOPE project in Denmark, which actually is at Aarhus University, which is fabulous in terms of it's really tracking the population's sentiment at all times. He should almost have been here, Michael Bang-Olsen, to talk about what actually they are looking at. But he has some ideas about the trolling on these, and I have the same experience with getting really bad reactions and sort of very hostile emails, and I try to engage and discuss with them, and I can't even get a response if I try to ask what their question really was. It's been peculiar.
Okay. I see that on the Q&A, people are still very active and reacting to each other. Are there questions? And as I know that all the other panelists also can see the Q&A. Are there questions that you would like to pick up from the Q&A and like to comment upon publicly because you think they are important?
Well, I think Dr. Pollock just raised a really important point, which is that just because you're critical towards a new vaccine doesn't mean you're an anti-vaxxer. And there has been some polarization there. This is true. I mean, I was not too sure I wanted my kids to have this new mRNA vaccines before I saw all the evidence that it was safe and effective. So, I mean, I don't think I'm myself an anti-vaxxer for that reason. So I think that is a really good point. We should not be sort of putting people in pockets like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would like to add, there are just a lot of unknowns, even around vaccination. We didn't know how quickly they would wane and not be effective against Omicron, for example. So I think there are lots of unknowns and there are lots of uncertainties. Hold those, and that way tolerate people not knowing and uncertainties. And I think the other thing for vaccines is if the pharmaceutical industry, there's been a BMJ editorial today, I think, but you know, the pharmaceutical industry really need to be much more transparent in releasing the data. And we really should have really good trials of all our interventions, whether it be non-pharmaceuticals like maskings or of pharmaceutical prevention or vaccines, and these data should be in the public domain, and they're not, and that would be an amazing way to increase trust. But also the phase 4 studies are really important because with the mRNA vaccines, the jury is still out on the medium and long-term harms. So we really need to do the studies. Now that is not taking I'm a public health doctor, so there's no way I'm anti-vaccine, but it's saying, you know, we are giving billions of people these vaccines, so we have to put the data out there and do studies on the medium and long-term harms, especially for children. I think that's, well, for everybody, but especially if we're thinking about giving vaccines to children.
Can I say something? Yeah, I think we probably all agree on that it is important that we continue to gather evidence. And I am also aware, for example, on vaccine, there are many ongoing studies at the moment where they are evaluating adverse outcomes. I would also really want to suggest that we think much wider than randomized controlled trials when we evaluate different interventions, because I think often randomized controlled trials are not the right tool to use. For example, when we look at vaccine adverse outcome, we often use self-controlled studies because we can't use randomized controlled trials because the outcome is so rare. So nobody in the world would afford to fund trials, but it doesn't mean that we can't investigate it. But as an epidemiologist, I think it's very important to look at what method is the right method and what study design should we use. And we should also go much wider and not only think about medical studies, but learn from other areas of the world. So for example, with mask, it may be more relevant to look at studies of physics, or it could be studies in other settings, that we shouldn't shy away from gathering evidence from many different fields and use as many different kind of designs.
Well, I would like to comment on top of that. I completely agree with you. I think that there are many, especially I want to talk about these, the difficulty of making a good trial to demonstrate or to get the ultimate real life evidence that masks and tests are working requires large randomized cluster control studies that would be like expensive. It would almost be impossible to pull it off, also for the ethical constraints of it. For the testing and what have you. So really we've discussed that in Denmark a lot lately, where I'm thinking, well, sometimes you have to resort to something else, the logic of it, like the face mask, you can, if engineers know it stop the aerosols, then you can model out what the effect might be from first principles or something, and that has to be the way we do it. The alternative to not using these excellent tools would be like a disastrous in terms of epidemic control. In Denmark, I think that our group thinks that the face mask probably reduced the contact number by 25%, and the mass testing program we had about the same. And that allowed us to live a little more open and have excellent epidemic control without living in very close down societies like they had many places around the world.
Yeah.
I mean, I did a very, very simple back of the envelope calculation for a test, and said, okay, if you have no test, one person may on average infect 5 people, and if you go 5 generations, that would be 3,125 people would get infected. If you apply a test and you say, okay, people who test, they may still infect some, but they may not infect that many, let's say 2. After 5 generations, you would have infected 32. And that's no evidence as such, but it's applying a simple logic or whatever you would call it. And I think we sometimes have to start there. It doesn't mean that there are things we can test and we should test, but some of it may be doing qualitative research, asking people about how do they feel about test, what is the barriers, and that may be the questions that we really should look into rather than necessarily the transmission as such.
Yeah, Allyson, yeah.
I'm worried that we're in danger of throwing out well-established public health principles, established principles for things like tests and screening. And you might even have the best test in the world, but the whole issue is the intervention that follows that, whether you have the capacity, whether you can yield, cost benefit. So I think we should really go back to our classic public health principles You know, these are tried and tested. We've used them for a long time. Now, the other principle that I didn't talk about is the whole issue of symptoms. You know, the government could have had a people, if you have symptoms, stay at home and we'll support you to stay at home as well. It didn't. And instead it's rolled out this mass testing program, which, as you see, it's cost billions and it hasn't worked. So I think sometimes, and the other thing it didn't do was reintegrate testing into clinical diagnosis. So I do think we need to go back to the classic tools of public health. One of the big problems is that we've rolled them out in a blanket fashion in a way that they were never. So I would remind everybody that, you know, the textbook epidemiology in public health is very useful and we shouldn't lose sight of that. And even when it comes to trials, it's no good now saying we're in the middle of an epidemic, we can't do trials of masks or whatever. We're 2 years on now and we could do all sorts of things. Everybody, very clever people, step wedge trials, all sorts of, there are things that we can do. I agree with Irene, we need more than just randomized controlled trials. But I do think that we need to not lose the science. Health principles.
Okay.
Well, the public health principles already have a problem. They had it for a long time. For example, a really good idea is to put in sanitation in a low-income country, but you need a randomized cluster control study to really demonstrate the efficacy of this. So therefore, such very good ideas lose all the time to clinical trials of medication and vaccines where you actually can produce this evidence. So this is not like this is a long-lasting issue. It's not just for face masks or for mass testing. This thing is really notoriously difficult to test and demonstrate. But it doesn't mean it doesn't work.
You're making a parody. That's a parody.
No, I'm quite serious about this. I'm very serious.
Masks still are unproven. The theory behind them is great, but
we actually had a clinical trial here in Denmark where people wore masks, and then so it's only one side of the equation you test. The one are the people who wear masks protected, and there was a protective effect. 25% or something like that. It wasn't and you never tested the important thing, which really is what if the people who are infected wear masks and not infecting the other people? That's a really hard one.
That's a hard question, and I've been thinking hard about it. And the problem is that the exposure, whether you are infected, change all the time. But you can't, if you measure it, it would be unethical to do the trial, to let people who are infectious stay in the trial. And therefore, it is very, very difficult to design a good, even clustered randomized controlled trial where you can be certain that the outcome you estimate is due to the mask and not to variation in exposure. And I think that's the reason why we don't see many randomized controlled trials on that. But I am a great fan of randomized controlled trials. I just think we need to focus using them on the right questions. And in terms of measuring change in transmission, I think randomized controlled trials are not the right tool.
Okay, that's it. It's an important, very general discussion, of course, to what extent we should or we are allowed to base our actions, say, on theory, insight, logic, or whether we always want to have the ironclad randomized controlled trials. And there is a rather gray area between these two positions, and it might depend very much on circumstances, on convictions, but it also proves that, say, at the front line of science, where science makes progress, where you try out new things like mass masking, that you're not always certain about what you do. There is no ironclad certainty about what you do, and it's maybe something that you have to live with, that it doesn't exist for some interventions.
But it must count for something, that you can go in a laboratory, put a mask on, and demonstrate how the particles do not come out.
This is, I know,
it must be good.
No. I mean, I'm trying to be as general and objective as possible. I'm all for the mask side, also based on experiments with cages with guinea pigs, where they wrapped mask tissue around one cage with infected and not around the other ones and things like that, and they could see how the mask tissue really stopped a lot of infections and things like that. But still, people might continue to argue, like the tobacco industry argued against all the trials showing that if you paint tar from tobacco smoke on the ears of rabbits, that they develop cancer. And the tobacco industry says, oh, that's not an argument. It's not even a human, it's not how cigarettes are used. So we discard the argument. Other people will say, it shows that there are carcinogens in tobacco smoke. Okay. There you are. And you have at a certain point to integrate evidence. Irene.
Can I raise another point? Because I think one thing I have learned from this pandemic is how slow the research process is, and often too slow. And I don't have a good answer exactly to how we can speed it up. But I have, for example, seen many people then ended up publishing manuscripts that haven't been peer reviewed. And sometimes it's been good because you really needed that information. But at other times, I think it's been terrible because we have lost the quality control of our research, the peer review. But I think this is certainly something we have seen during the last couple of years.
Yes, and it's very interesting because suddenly peer review was done by Twitter, and sometimes even peer-reviewed papers were torn down by Twitter, and rightly so. It happens during the epidemic. But I think on this note, we will have to look at our watches and look at the time, because I was strict about the speakers, so let's also be strict about the discussion. It's almost 4 o'clock. I want to wholeheartedly thank our 3 speakers. On behalf of the Department of Clinical Epidemiology at Aarhus, I want to thank all the participants who were so greatly present and who continued listening and who continued, as I see still now, reacting to each other and reacting to each other's ideas. So thank you very much, speakers, participants, and last but not least, the organizers like Helle Veste of this symposium. Thank you all. Have a good day and shortly a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.